So as I generally start these meetings, this is the Kubernetes community meeting for, actually I am going to mute you, Smain, until you get started because you have a lot of background noise. There we go, you're muted now. Hello, hey, Kubernetes community meeting. Today is April 19th, 20th, 21st. Holy cow. Today is April 21st, and we are going to go through a couple of things today. We will have a demo from Smain, which is why we were doing the audio checks just a moment ago, about Kargo by kubespray, a cluster deployment management tool. Then we're going to hear from Brendan Burns talking about third-party objects and a Kubernetes workflow proposal. This is sort of a trimmed down version of the broader Kubernetes efforts proposal. While we continue to talk about that and figure out what the solution is there, we end up maybe moving forward with this feature workflow proposal. And then Clayton came in and said he wanted to talk about some protobuf work. So we've got a pretty big agenda today, as well as any SIG updates if we have time, and notices. So let me put my notices up top. The week of May 5th, or our weekly meeting, the first week of May, will be at the Asia-friendly time of 5 p.m. Pacific time. It's unfriendly for a lot of others, but our community members from Asia have been dialing in at crazy odd hours. So we want to say thank you to them and do something that's a little bit gracious to them. So let's get started, and I will find Smain and unmute him. And then whoops, we both.
Okay, so sorry, I have a problem with my sound, so I can't hear you, but maybe you can hear me.
We can hear you fine, yeah. I'm
sharing the screen. Okay. So I'm Smain. I'm a member of a team kubespray, and actually you can have a look through our projects on GitHub. We have two main projects. We have KPM, which allows to deploy applications on top of Kubernetes. Actually, Antoine will do a demo next week. And we have Kargo, and that's what I'm going to show you. So what is Kargo? So Kargo is an open source project we started about 1 year ago. Started it from a production use case. We had a video on demand application on Heroku, and we needed to migrate this application into our own data centers. So it can be used to deploy a Kubernetes cluster on bare metal, AWS, GCE, and recently we had contributions on OpenStack. So it comes with a simple command line tool, which is really simple to use. You can run a production ready cluster with it, but you can also run it for development purpose on a single node. So as I said, it's really simple. Yesterday I was speaking at the DevOps. It's the most important development conference in France, and we were able to bootstrap to run 60 clusters of 3 nodes and each attendee have been able to run his cluster on his laptop with Kargo, actually. So it's simple, as I said. It's simple, yes, but so the default options are fine. You can deploy your default options, but you have a lot of options to fit your needs. So, for instance, you can choose the network plugin you want to run inside your cluster. You can, in the future, you will be able to choose the container gene, so Docker or Kit. You will be able to choose the configuration database, TCD, console. So, and we did a special focus on the tests because everything moves fast in the Kubernetes world, and the way to test each change, and we didn't want to break anything. So we want to be up to date for each component we have on the playbook. but we still want to do tests, to trigger tests each time we do a change. So I can show you, we have a lot of tests. Each combination is tested. For instance, Flannel with Debian, with CentOS, or Calico with Red Hat, with CoreOS. So each combination is tested, and it runs a cluster of 3 nodes to test if everything works fine. So it's run the cluster, and at the end it checks that each pod can communicate each other. So the test is pretty complete. So I'm going to start the demo. Okay. So it can be installed with the command pipe, very simply like that. Sorry, Kargo. So it's installed, and you have three steps. The first step is to configure the config file. It looks like that. So you have some options to create VMs on the cloud providers, so on AWS or on GCE. So I'm going to create 3 instances on the GCE. Okay. So, so it's going to create the VMs, and you can do the same command line. The same command line is available for AWS, and you have some options you can add if you have a look to the options. And for the bare metal, if you already have your servers, you can use the command prepare, which should only generate the inventory you will use for the deployment. And you can add a node to a running cluster like that. So with the option add, you can update your current inventory, and then you will have to deploy again with the same options as the previous one. So all the command line you can find on all the options, sorry, you can find in the config file. You can overwrite it with the command line. It's really useful when you just have to change the type of the server or the image you want to use. So it will run, it will create the VMs. I will show you the VMs are created. Okay. So I have to update. Pretty slow, sorry. Okay, so you have your VMs running. So now you have to run the deployment. So as I said, the default options are fine. So you just have to do a deploy and specify that it will be deployed on GCE. And from now on, it takes about 10 minutes to have a cluster running. So I won't go till the end of the deployment, but just a moment, just to explain, it's just a wrapper on top of Ansible commands. So you can still use the Ansible commands, but it's really easy to use this command line. So deployment is running, and I recorded a video in order to speed up the deployment. So I will show you. Okay, so I choose the network plugin Calico, and the deployment is running. So it downloads the binaries, configures the etcd cluster. So you should have three nodes at least. It creates the certificates, it synchronizes the certificates between nodes, install all the packages for instance, Docker or all the missing packages, the required packages, sorry. And it configures the masters, so it installs the API servers on 2 nodes, as well as the controller and scheduler, and with the master election process. Start everything. And at the end of this demo, I check that everything is working fine. So I run deployment of 3 pods and check that everything is working. Okay.
Smain, I'm not sure you can hear our audio, but there are a couple of questions in chat too.
Slides. Okay. So, as I said, the project is, we are working closely with the network vendors. From the beginning, we started to talk with Calico, and we'll soon be able to integrate Renana too. And we open issues, we talk often with them. And we had some noticeable contribution from companies like Raken, Totonet for OpenStack. And we need some contribution, so we need you. We need some tests. We need you to test it, to plan it, to open issues, and eventually to add the contributions. So the roadmap now is we have that's the most important points, but we have a lot of points pending. So we are aiming to manage the life cycle of the cluster. We want to add nodes. It is already possible to remove them, to upgrade the Kubernetes to a specific version. We are working on integrating some new network plugins like Renana Control. And we want to give the option to the users to choose if they want to run all the components inside pods, because we did the choice for operation reasons. We did a choice to run some components inside the nodes as a service, as a system service. And we are looking forward to look it to at the end of the year, I think. So you can find the link. You can check out our repository, test it, as I said. You don't hesitate to ping me on Slack. I'm on Slack, and I participate to the C cluster ops too. So you can join it. We are working on these kind of issues. So don't hesitate. Thank you all. So I opened the sound, sorry, because I have to open the sound, sorry.
There are some questions in chat.
If you have questions, I think you should, sorry, I have my colleague Antoine, and his Zoom is working better than me. So maybe I use his laptop. Just a moment. Okay, so let me introduce Antoine. He will be speaking at the next. Hi.
Hello to both of you. There are some questions in the Zoom chat. Can Kargo create, manage, and distribute TLS certs? And then to follow up, where are the cert details configurable?
Okay. Yes, it creates the certificates, distributes them, and when you, for instance, add node, think the certificates with the new added. So every deployment, you can add a new node if you want, and it will be added to the cluster.
Yes, the certificate point was quite painful to implement. So this is the major part. So everything we communicate with the API master through TLS, HTTPS only. So we synchronize each, we authorize each node to, we add each node in the certificate to be able to contact the API master. So.
There's also another question in there. Is there an upgrade path for the cluster as new versions of Kubernetes come out that doesn't require a full teardown?
Yeah, you want to. So this is part of the life cycle in the roadmap. So now we don't have the command, but it's something we definitely want to add to make people just say, okay, I want to upgrade from 1.2 to 1.3, and the script will just run in the best practice to get just a railing update of your cluster.
Actually, it will be soon added because I already did the test, and if there's not a lot of work to get the upgrade working, so it will be soon integrated, I guess. I hope.
Soon, okay. Thank you both for the demo. If there are any other questions, you had some example, or you had some contact information on there. Can you add that to the document where we put you in the agenda so that you can, so people can reach out to you? And then maybe a couple of notes of key points, because we didn't have a note taker during your demo, sadly. So if you've got key points you want to put in there, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And thank you. So now I am going to go ahead and ask if we can get a note taker for the rest of this before I kick off the third-party objects update from Brendan Burns. So Brendan, are you about?
I'm here.
Awesome. And Smana, Smain, if you could stop sharing your other screen, that would also be helpful. And then I think Brendan can share if he's going to, or Eric.
I'll share screen.
Perfect.
Let's see. Here we go.
Thank you, Smain. All right, and now we are off and running with third-party objects and Brendan Burns.
All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
All right, cool. So I want to give a quick update on the state of third-party objects, mostly to kind of give everyone some ideas about how they want to build things going forward. This code did not quite make it into 1.2, but will be available. It's available now at head, and it's will be part of the 1.3 release. And basically, the demo that I want to show is how we can effectively use this infrastructure to create Kubernetes kernel modules, or the analogy of a kernel module for a Kubernetes cluster. So, your kernel that ships with the operating system is monolithic, and it's hard to add things and remove things, but kernel modules enable you to dynamically add support for various features. And I think that going forward, I think this is how we should think about extending the Kubernetes API rather than adding, lots and lots of API objects to the main line. Thinking about having modules that different users can, and even take from third parties, that different users can insert into their cluster for a time being. Okay, so I'll give a little bit of a demo of this. I have a simple Kubernetes cluster running right now. It's just got one node in it. There's nothing really running there right now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do kube control run this demo module. All right. I guess before that, I should do the there's nothing up my sleeves part, which is I'll say kube control get demos. So I'm going to create this third-party object called demo. And it's going to say, oh, it doesn't have the resource type demos. I don't know about that resource type. So now I'm going to run and insert this module. So what you'll see now, if we list our pods, is there's this demo module running. So if we do a kube control logs on that, what you'll see here is it says third-party resource demo.experimental.kubernetes.io created. So one of the things that's important here is that all these objects are prefixed by a domain name so that we can have different namespaces for objects, so that if I choose the name demo and somebody else chooses the name demo, they're not going to conflict with each other. It says watching for new objects, and then briefly, you'll see, I should have said -f, so I follow it. Briefly, you'll see here, it says the server doesn't have the resource type demos, doesn't have the resource type demos, doesn't. So that error message is coming back because you create a third-party object, but it's a little bit asynchronous before the actual API paths are pathed in. So for a brief moment, it's not there. But now if we go back over here and we say kube control get demos, we get an empty list. So it didn't give me that error. There's no demos created, so it just gave me the empty list. And indeed, if I say -o JSON, you'll see that we get back a list. And this is actually a Kubernetes style object. It has the API version. It has the metadata that you would expect. Okay. So now let's take a look at one of my demo objects. Actually, before I do that, let me just create it, just so you that. So I'm going to say kube control create -f demo.json. And now this object is created. And if you were looking over here, that module that I registered now said object added, right? So at this point, if it were a more complete module and not just a demo, it now knows about this object and it can start managing it, right? So you can imagine that the replication controller could be implemented by one of these modules. We're lacking some features, and I'll talk about that at the very end to make us actually want to do that right now. But you can easily imagine creating new objects and then managing those objects, and by managing them, creating other objects. So creating something that then creates pods, or creating something that then creates services, that sort of thing. So let's take a look at that demo.json. So again, you'll see here, this is the standard Kubernetes object metadata. So we have kind, we have a metadata, we have an API version. In this case, the API version is experimental kubernetes.io v1. I actually declared the v1. I can declare whatever I want, right? I can call it v-foo or v25. And those version numbers are independent of the version numbers that the Kubernetes API itself uses. So users get to do those themselves. And I can actually then, and then we can say, if I try and, so let's say kube control get demos my object 2 -o JSON. We get back the JSON, and what you can see here is that there's this resource version 2002. And so now if I go in and via demo.json and I actually add the resource version field here, but I give it something else, let's say 200. Now I'm going to do kube control update, or what's it called now, replace -f demo.json. And what you'll see here, oh, that should not have worked. Oh, I think it's because it needs to be in the metadata, right? I can edit JSON. There was just a tweet I saw about people complaining about the trailing comma in JSON. So now, sorry, now you'll see this error, and it says error from server, error when replacing demo.json, the server reported a conflict. So these objects, despite being defined by end users, have all of the semantics of a standard Kubernetes object. You can do compare and swap, you can do watch, you can do all of the stuff that you would expect to be able to do, and they integrate naturally, as you can see, with kube control commands. And so that's about it. I don't really have anything else to talk about there, but I think as people are thinking about things that they may want to add to their cluster, I think hopefully this is going to mean that you can effectively create things for a cluster, prototype things for a cluster, without ever landing any code in the main Kubernetes repo, and potentially maintain it forever that way, right? And so that I think this is going to provide a great deal more flexibility. You can implement your API objects in Java or Python or Bash or whatever you want to do, right? And I think that's going to add a lot of flexibility for users as we go forward. So I highly encourage people to think about how they might structure things like that.
Validation.
That's it. Oh, I should also say that as I did this, I found some bugs. So I'm going to be continuing to sort of push out and fix the bugs that exist still. Kube control edit doesn't work with these objects, for example.
Hey, could you, Brendan, could you comment on this work relative to the idea of a third-party scheduler as a production grade kind of plugin, as opposed to, say, I don't know, like experimental work on the API?
I think it's a little bit different, right? I mean, this is really about introducing new objects, whereas an experimental scheduler is about different binary manipulating existing objects. Right, and so I think we have a different mechanism for experimental schedulers, and I think it's necessary because we want to change. You know, we don't want users to, in some sense, we want the scheduler to be hidden from the user, right? Like if the cluster administrator wants to have a different scheduler, they want the same kube control create pods to use that new scheduler without the user actually doing anything. Whereas here, I think inherently the user knows about these experimental objects or these extension objects because they're interacting with the objects directly.
It might be the case that a third-party scheduler has a feature in it that is not supported. That's like an extra feature that requires an API extension in some respects to access it.
Yeah, so we've talked about this in different contexts, and I think so. One option would be, of course, that you could actually. I mean, you could do an experimental scheduler this way. You could create sort of a shadow pod object and then have the experimental scheduler read those shadow pods and then schedule the pods directly by setting host. I mean, in some sense, that's exactly what daemon set does, right? But at the same time, we've had a discussion about how you could have opaque params. Like, I think what you're talking about is more like opaque params, which is I kind of want to shove some data inside a pod object and have the scheduler know about it without having the underlying system know about it. And right now that would have to be done via annotations, and it's kind of crufty. We've talked about having full-on JSON objects inside of annotations, but that's...
Yeah, and we are putting JSON inside of annotations, and this is exactly how we're adding new experimental scheduling features. We're adding them as annotations to existing pods. So pod affinity and anti-affinity, node affinity and anti-affinity, taints, all of these things are being added via annotations today.
Right. So that's the right way to do that kind of stuff.
Brandon, there were a couple of questions, one of which might be really quick. What is in the demo module pod?
It's just a simple script that goes and talks to the Kubernetes API and looks at those demo object. First thing it does is it creates the object itself. So I should have shown, actually, I didn't show.
The other question was
here's the actual third-party object definition. So what the very first thing the script does is it goes and it creates an extension object using this object description, and then it goes to the API path for those newly created object resources, and it just watches the objects in those resources and it looks for changes. And a more thorough example would then, given the changes, would actually take some effect on the world.
Okay.
Another example I know that they're actually playing around with in networking is they're actually, I think, using this mechanism for network policy objects.
Okay. We also had a question about validation. What about?
So that's the big weakness right now, which is that all of the mainline server infrastructure that we've built for object conversion and object validation and admissions control currently does not apply to this stuff. And there's been a great deal of discussion about how we might go forward with that. And it's clearly something that's necessary in the limit, but I don't think there's a complete consensus yet. Brian might correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a complete consensus about how to do it. We have some ideas. It would involve hooking out. So this module container would implement a web service in addition to monitoring the APIs. And so validation and object translation would happen by having the API server call out to this module to say, hey, validate this, or, default, add defaults to this or whatever else.
Yeah, and we need something similar to have out-of-process admission control.
Yeah.
So probably I would try to find a way to use that same mechanism, whatever we build. One thing we're discussing is called the initializers proposal, where we would postpone any action in the API server on an object until all initialization, including validation and whatnot, were finished. That changes the client experience pretty dramatically, so we're still discussing other alternatives.
Is that happening in the API machinery SIG?
It would, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing to say there is I think they're totally independent in the sense that most of what this is trying to do is make storage and API, sort of the API interface easy to create, and the externalized validation and an externalized initialization. I mean, you could imagine doing that for existing API objects that are linked in, right? You could want to have extra validation for pods in your cluster, right?
Yeah,
So
and the admission controllers are examples of that. They're effectively, other reasons why you might reject a resource.
Yeah, exactly.
Or set defaults or whatever. Yeah, so.
Okay, there were 2 more questions, and I'm not 100% clear on if they're easy or not. Any new thoughts on supporting Spec versus status pattern? It would be useful when overlaying policy on third-party resources.
Yeah, this is an interesting. I think it needs to be optional. I guess we had this sort of fight initially when I'm turning off my screen. We had this fight when we first started putting this stuff in. It's a challenge to say like, oh, how much do you want to restrict the end user versus and enforce a convention versus how much do you want to have generic tooling?
Yeah, and my recommendation for now is to just create separate resources for Spec and status, if that's what you want.
That's also part of it, right? Is that there's also been a discussion of actually separating Spec and status in a couple of resources because we don't want to have to do, because there are objects out there that have lots of status updates but very little Spec changes. Pods are an example of this, and you don't actually want to have to like read and write that full object all the time and have conflicts.
The other question I had, Brendan, that was my first question there, was as it relates to the whole finalizer, dependent, and owner guardian discussion, do we see any issues with third-party resources and those concepts?
I think we need to make sure that they work.
I guess some of those discussions I was asking that, like, I want to be able to say things like this kind should not be able to be supported as like a thing that you can exert a parent reference to, or like how the garbage collector or scanner is going to work on some of these resources. So I'm not sure we.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the stuff just is a question of making sure that when we write a lot of this stuff, it is dynamic in terms of discovering objects via the API endpoints, right? So a lot of the work that I did to support this was basically going through kube control and a bunch of other places, and in places where things were hard coded, making it talk to the server and download all the API objects front, right? And so I would hope that if we do that in all of the right places, it should just work, because these things should be imperceptible. Like, there shouldn't be perceptual differences between them, but obviously it's hard if you want to pre-assert, like if you want to pre-assert that relationship before the object exists, just in case it maybe exists, that becomes difficult.
Yeah, I guess what I was looking for is like, whatever we do to allow you to describe a kind in the API server machinery, we need to make sure it stays in sync with how I describe my third-party resource. So like if we do allow concepts of saying, this is not something that supports dependencies, I want to make sure I have that knob on third-party resource. And yeah, so anyway, I'm just calling that out. Like as we grow what the internal API machinery lets you do to control things, we should probably make sure that third-party resource stays the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you do all that stuff and you make sure that it's all keyed by API group and version, it should just work. I would think, right? Like if you make sure that when you declare those things, you declare them with a full API group version, etc., API group version kind, then it should, I would imagine it should work, right? I think that where you might get into trouble is if we skip the due diligence because we know that things are hard, statically compiled in.
Yeah, so I think we should just discuss that in the API machinery SIG as we develop these additional generic mechanisms for APIs.
Awesome. And there was one more question, which may potentially be Quentin just trolling us. Have you given any thought to portability between clusters, i.e. my application relies on external resources X, Y, and Z, which happen to exist in my test cluster, but nobody installed them in my production cluster?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, I think that's, in my mind, that's no different than like, oh, hey, you forgot to run the Cassandra service.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, your app should probably die, and maybe you want to have some precondition checking, but and I mean, in the limit, we may have some sort, like, I think higher level tools start looking at these kind of dependency management, where it's like, make sure that Cassandra is deployed. I guess I don't see it any different than any other kind of dependency. And I would hope that any dependency management tools that are built on top of Kubernetes would understand those dependencies as well.
Help them understand, yes.
I don't think that I want to do any kind of deep dependency stuff here any more than like, if you haven't inserted the module that handles your USB, wireless driver, and you insert that USB stick. I mean, I guess at this point, Linux actually will. They do actually have a dependency manager, but it's not the kernel. I don't think the kernel. The kernel itself doesn't go, hey, I should insert this module. It's some other third-party daemon that looks and scans USB and sees a version code and then does the insmod for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like running the other add-ons we have, right? Like if you want to use DNS, you better be running DNS. So,
right.
The other question I have, Brendan, which I think is interesting, is I could see value in only wanting to support this particular third-party resource in this particular namespace, so that, like if I have an offering like, say, OpenShift or something that wants to allow particular users in their particular projects to add modules scope to just their namespace, that seems interesting.
Yeah, we explicitly in the design, we explicitly decided to not have object scope to namespaces because it complicates things dramatically. But I sort of can understand it, I guess, but like, I don't know. It would make things a lot harder.
All right, so this is the last question, and then we'll go on to the next agenda item. How different is the third-party object from the third-party resource that is already there in extensions v1 beta 1, and is v1 beta 1 in v1.2?
It's the same thing. It's just the support there. I mean, that thing's turned off by default, and the support in kube control and other things isn't as good. So there's some refinements. There was a backwards incompatible refinement to the API object. So I would say that the stuff that's in there is just, it was not quite done. And so you can turn it on and you can kind of play around with it, but it doesn't have kube control support. It doesn't have very good kube control support, and it's not forwards compatible with the stuff that's at head.
Then third-party resources is going to then be deprecated and third-party object become the...
No, they're the same. There is no third-party object. It's
got it.
It's all third-party resource.
Got it. Okay, perfect.
There's this stuff all becomes very meta because there's the definition of the object, which is like the class definition, and then there's the instance of the object itself, and they're both third party. And so I sort of use third party resource to describe the definitions of the objects, and third party object to describe the instance of that resource. Although actually in the code it's called third party resource data. Anyway, the code reviews were kind of fun because there was all this abstraction going on. Anyway.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brendan. I'm sure people will ping you if there are further questions.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. On to Kubernetes feature workflow proposal from Eric Toon.
Okay. I'm going to try to present.
You will succeed at presenting, Eric. Click. See?
Okay. Do people see a presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm presenting a proposal for Kubernetes feature workflow. It is inspired by Joe's earlier proposal, but it's a little bit more tactical. So it's compatible with, but it doesn't try to address all the things that Joe's did.
And we'll keep working on Joe's proposal, even if this is something we agree upon.
Exactly. So the problem for people who are not following closely on that proposal is that a couple things. Contributors don't know what the expectations are for a PR. They don't know if they should code first, or if they should design first, or how many tests they should write, and how good it should be when they first contribute it versus later on, and who they need to go to get approval for specific parts of code. For some, or specific parts of the feature addition process. For code, we have a proposal to add owners files, and I'm assuming that that gets implemented. Another problem is there's like multiple approvals needed, but there's no one who's single job. So multiple approvals include, we have people that are API experts that can do API reviews. We have test experts that can decide if you're using the right test primitives. We have documentation experts. There's no single expert who can sort of say, is this feature done? And even if there were a single person, like we don't have sort of the staffing to have people that just shepherd issues all the time from Google or from other people who work full-time. So we would like to expand to the community so that project management can be more distributed process. If you want to drive something, we'll tell you what you need to do to drive it, but you, as that feature owner, are the driver for it. So it's about not just giving you responsibility to decide what happens with your feature, power, but also responsibility to make sure it goes through all those steps. And the way we make sure that you sort of follow through on that responsibility is you're going to generate a summary for us that someone else can look at quickly and say, yeah, they did do all the steps. But the sort of busy work of going through all the conversations of getting an approval, that's on someone who's driving a feature. And one kind of related issue, which this is not totally addressing, but got me thinking, was that we had the problem that the community cannot label issues or PRs. This is only somewhat solving that problem. But if people are familiar with that problem, and there has actually been a workaround that's been discovered recently, but generally we don't want everyone to be a committer, but only committers can put labels on things in GitHub. So the solution that I'm proposing involves a new thing which I call a feature issue. And a feature issue is a structured type of issue. It's an umbrella. There's going to be many other, might be sub-issues under there. But for each major feature that we're going to propose to add, we're going to have a feature issue that tracks that feature. And you might say, why not also efforts like making testing less flaky or making documentation better? Well, a feature I figured out what a defined lifetime and set of steps are for that. I have not been able to generalize that to more open-ended efforts like have no test flakes or have awesome docs. Whereas a feature, it goes through a series of releases and you can and you know what you have to do and you can know when it's done. So that's why I'm focusing on features. And so with a feature, there is this notion of a checklist of approvals that you need. This checklist will grow. Hopefully it won't be too heavyweight, but we also want to maintain quality. So there does need to be a series of things we check for a new feature. And it allows the community member to drive the process, but it allows the committers to verify that that person driving it didn't overlook anything. So this is maybe the most controversial part of the proposal, which is that I want to put these feature issues in a new repository called Kubernetes/features. And the thought there, I'll explain why another repository in a second. And the fourth aspect of this proposal is that we need some kind of policy for which changes require feature issues. We definitely don't want every time you send a PR that you have to follow this heavyweight process. We only want this heavyweight process for big changes to the system. And I don't have an exact document for that, but if people agree to this, we would define a document that said, like, this type of thing requires a feature issue and this type of thing doesn't. So I would imagine stuff that's not visible to users, like fixing a test, refactoring code, adding a rate limit to a server, that would not require a feature issue. Something that has an API change or a new type of object, that would definitely be a feature issue. And as a middle ground, we're going to have to figure out as we go. I see a flashing thing at the top of my screen that tells me maybe there's questions. Sarah, is that happening? Are we getting chat questions?
We are.
Should pause now or continue?
So Bob actually was kibitzing, saying, well, that wouldn't work for any other feature either. Make performance awesome, make API awesome or something.
I was really just proposing or asking the question, why not include doc updates as features and just treat them the same way?
Because doc update, so if you add a feature, then part of the checklist for that feature should be to add documentation for it. And a documentation owner should look at your feature description and say, okay, he's adding a foo kind, and I don't see a page for kind foo. You're not done. But saying docs should be easier to understand, that's not a well-defined process.
No, I'm thinking more along the lines of examples, overviews, like clear places which are existing documentation needs to be, that's not feature oriented perhaps, needs to be improved around X. Why not treat that like a feature and go through the same process here?
Oh, I think it can.
What you said, I don't think it's the same process. If someone else wants to come up with a proposal convincing me what the checklist is for like a docs change, I'd love to hear that. This isn't a process to generate free labor. It's a process to like enable someone to follow, to meet our standards.
I guess another way of thinking about that is whether we want to like create some retroactive feature issues. If we know that there's a feature that exists, but it doesn't have docs and it doesn't have tests and doesn't have whatever, rather than creating feature issues to fix the docs or to fix the test, go back and create a feature issue for the whole feature. And
Yes.
then, tick off the stuff that's there, and the stuff that isn't there, is now reflected in a feature.
And we have these things
Part of this is
for
about
alpha.
hitting. Sorry, Eric.
We have these like requirements for graduation to alpha and beta. I think all those, that would be kind of a model for what we're talking about. And we would probably open issues for things that are still in alpha or beta and track them under this new system. And I guess if there's stuff that's already stable, but we want something on, maybe we'd open issues for those. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and an important part of this is coming up with a concrete checklist for what needs to get done, which is, at least some 80 or 90% relevant to stuff that people actually need to do. And work on docs is going to be dramatically different than that. And separately, we do have a proposal that was posted to Kubernetes Dev about how we want to reorganize the docs and what we want docs to look like. There's a PR out with a number of documentation templates. So we are trying to put into place enough structure that will make it clear to people what they need to do to write good docs and what their docs should look like and such. That's a separate effort. I'd be happy if you provided feedback on that or got involved.
Another comment would be like,
Follow-up question, does this apply to contrib, or how do you think about contrib in this regard?
I want contrib to go away.
I want there to be a federal system where like, if you're just changing docs, then there's no top level process. Talk with the docs community. If you're just changing code, then like in Kubelet to like fix a bug, then just talk to them. Only if it cuts across the whole user experience do you need to track it at this high level. That's my thinking.
So let's double back to Bob's contrib question, though, because I think as much as the flip answer of contrib needs to go away because it's confused, it is definitely an answer. I would just be slightly broader in this, which is, Bob, that's out of scope for this discussion simply because we need to figure out what to do with contrib. It's got a mishmash of stuff in it right now. And we can come up with a broader plan around that. But I would say that this is not specific. The feature issue proposal is not specific to contrib at this point.
Well, I wasn't planning on going down this line of questioning, but you're kind of making me do so, which is we were actually thinking of adding something to contrib, and now you're think maybe we shouldn't do that. So
I wasn't planning for that to put
if the intention with this discussion was to put a brakes on that, you've probably just been effective across the whole user group in doing that. So
well, that was not my intent either. It's more we should address contrib as with intent and vision and figure that out. Because contrib has a very useful space, but it may not be as a repo under Kubernetes org because that limits who has rights on it. So we've talked about a broader organization potentially, or
it also doesn't make sense as a single repo. It's
right.
Totally unmaintainable. So it's not that a process like this shouldn't apply to stuff that people have put in contrib in the past. But we need to come up with a better way of managing stuff outside the main repo.
Yeah, the contrib is way to the side of what I was hoping to address today. Should I take more questions, Sarah, or keep going?
Let's go on. I think we had a slight digression on contrib there, of course, but.
Okay, so my thought with these feature issues is that you don't open one until you're like it's not for the initial discussion of what we should do. We can still keep using, we can use SIGs or the, Kubernetes/Kubernetes issues to talk about that. I'm not proposing to move all our existing issues, but like it's something you open when you're really ready to drive something. And the person who opens it should be the person, when they open, they're saying, I want to be the driver for this. So it's a way to say, I'm taking ownership of this issue. And you open it when you're ready to start work. And it's for things that have user visible behavior, not for internal refactoring. And I expect these issues are going to live a long time because they'll track the alpha, beta, and stable stages of a feature's lifetime. So that probably means they live for at least 3 releases in most cases. So the reason I said we should put these in a separate repository was, one, we can have different ACLs. And the other one is that issue templates seem like a really good way to present the workflow to users, because it puts this thing, a checklist at the top of the issue. And you can only have one issue template per repository. So that's kind of the thing that was really driving me to a new repository. The other thought was that big features are going to span multiple repositories. Already you need docs and docs, code in Kubernetes. We've talked about splitting Kubernetes, like maybe kubelet goes to its own repository a year from now. So you're going to be spanning repositories with large work anyhow. So it's kind of not a big deal to have a separate repository. And the fact that it's single purpose, to me, when you go there, it's more focused what you're thinking about. I actually found the fact that docs were moved to a new repository, I was really skeptical of that at the beginning. I found it's been fantastic. That repo has its own workflow, and it works well. So I think by making its own repo, it'll have its own workflow, its own automation, and it'll be clear when you go there what's going to happen. So this is like a sketch of a feature checklist that you might have. It has alpha, beta, and stable. Different stages have different things that you need to do, like get an API design review, make sure that you have some testing, and then it has a list of teams that you would go to for testing. So rather than like spending a lot of time on this slide, I actually want to go to a demo, which I've created, and Sarah's going to help me with the demo. So we're both going to go to github.com/erictoon/features. And I am someone who wants to drive a new feature, so I'm going to create a new issue. Can you guys all see GitHub? So I'm going to make a new issue. I've never done this before, but I really want resources in Kubernetes to have a color. So I'm going to title this Colors for Resources. I'm going to submit the issue. That issue is going to make the template be, submitting it's going to make the template be readable. Now I'm going to read the template and see what I need to do. Okay. There's advice on what alpha and beta and stable mean. Before it's alpha, I know I need to propose my feature. I'm going to read some advice, follow a link to propose my feature. I'm going to put this down here. I'm going to say, all objects get new meta Okay, so here's my design proposal. All objects are going to have a color. I've precised a standard for how those colors should be specified. I think my design proposals is thorough enough that someone can review it. Now I'm going to ask for a first step is a new feature reviews. Now I haven't set up this team, so I'm going to pretend that the team is somebody else. So I'm going to say, and then I'm going to wait. Sarah's been mentioned this would actually be a team. There'd be multiple people. There'd be some protocol for them to decide who picks it up. That'd be per team. She's going to say it looks good to me. I'm going to edit this. Okay, I proposed it, and I got an LGTM in the design review. Now, anyone who's not Sarah, not me, but like maybe a release manager can go through and say, okay, I look at, as we're coming up to the release, here's all these features that are happening in the community, and here's what their progress is. And I can also go check. Anyone can see what the progress is. So that is my mock-up, and I'll take any more questions.
So I like the general flow here, Eric. The one concern I had was doing too much in issue comments, because I can't add a comment to a particular line in your issue comment. So I feel like the one-page summary of your design should be like a PR into a repo, into this repo.
Or into a tome of knowledge, a design proposals repo.
Right. I mean, a lot of our issue discussions, you know, that one-page design thing ends up being where 100 comments come out of, right? So.
Yep. So you think that should be this? There should be docs in this new repo, and then you should do a PR against that to submit it, or
I haven't thought through where it should go enough, other than I don't like it being in a comment because it's going to make feedback on that design hard to give.
Okay.
Well, for what it's worth, I think we could probably stand to have as part of the feature process. You've got something about proposing the feature with the proposal. You could probably wrap the feature up with a document that describes how the feature was actually implemented in reality. Because I found that the design docs directory is a source of really good historical context, but a lot of it doesn't actually pertain to how the feature in question was actually implemented. And it can make it difficult for me to figure out whether a given design was actually implemented within a certain release of Kubernetes. And I think just adding a step to this checklist that says, just write up how the feature was actually done and maybe add a note to the original design doc or shuffle things around, whatever. I think that captures that discussion in source control. And I have no preference about whether it's this repo or the Kubernetes repo, but wherever the docs for this sort of stuff ultimately live.
So one of the steps in this checklist should be summarize all the design proposal and discussion and move it to like, here is the design, here's why we did it, and here's what we actually did. Is that?
That's good. I like that. But let me add to that, right? A feature gets implemented and then later it gets changed. Where do I go to find out how all the features are implemented now?
I assume you go to the documentation for that, right? But I want to make sure that I don't think the summary right up at the end is enough, right? I think if Sarah was to comment on your initial thing and say, I don't like your color choice, like I want to avoid having those long discussions in this feature issue. So I still think we need to have a doc that's the in progress iteration on the one-page summary of your feature.
I think you're right, Derek. I think this issue, the umbrella issue, should really just talk about progress and like whether you have the approvals you need or whether you need those approvals, not what standard to use for colors or what to name the field.
Exactly.
So I will take as an action to go back and think about how the design discussion flow works and how the design discussion wrap up works.
That said, this process looks like a massive improvement to where we are. And thank you so much for putting in the time for this, Eric. This is very pragmatic and this looks like a huge step forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. The whole idea is to try to start breaking up the blocking points and the pain points and get the community more broadly able to contribute in ways that they would like to and not have to ask for somebody to do silly administrative tasks.
Yeah, so I think where we should go with this, Eric, is we should just create the new repo and a PR for the template, and then we can just iterate on that.
Okay, I will do that, and I will make myself the whatever initial approver for the first couple of features, and then when the process gets going, then we'll spread power out more widely. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. One quick comment I have is that generally alpha, beta, and stable are going to be in different releases, so it'd be useful to have them as separate tracking issues so you can assign milestones to the individual. Like before alpha, alpha presumably will be targeted at a particular release milestone. Beta would be a different release milestone.
Okay, can't the milestone?
Can they be multiple milestones?
I see. What the I see.
And you can change the milestone and reuse the same issue, but people find that somewhat confusing, or they have in the past.
Well, how do you use, how are milestones used by project managers?
We use it to make sure that the stuff that needs to get done for the release is actually done.
But like if I gave you, like, do you need a milestone, or it can be a label saying that like this thing has some work targeted to 1.4?
Please let it be a milestone.
Okay.
I mean, it sort of looks like each of those before alpha, before beta, before stable bullet points would themselves be milestones or issues that would be attached to a milestone.
Maybe they need a sub issue and there needs to be a top level issue and an issue per alpha, beta, and stable. We can do that. It just seems issue heavy, but.
Yeah, I mean, limitations of the tools we have. So that's something we can take offline, whether the template includes all three and people delete the ones that are not relevant to what they're currently working on, or whether we have an umbrella of umbrellas or whatever, and we can hash that out offline.
So do we think does anyone think we haven't made a decision to proceed with this, or that we need more time? Sarah, any thoughts there?
I think it's great that we can go forward and iterate. I'm fine with that. I haven't heard anything that slows us down in that way other than trying to make it better. And it is 11:01, so people are going to start disappearing. So thank you all. And please raise your hand if there was any big concerns about the feature stuff, but it sounds like a great spot to start and iterate from here. See you all next week. Great work, Eric. See, comments, yay.